The crack of a rifle shot split the air, a sound as sharp and final as a breaking bone. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing Megan Sloan against the worn leather seat. Outside, the rhythmic drumming of 6 horses' hooves dissolved into a cacophony of panicked whinnies and the grating screech of locked wheels dragging through dust and gravel. A woman across from her screamed a thin, piercing sound that was quickly swallowed by the thunderous arrival of riders. "Everybody out," a voice boomed raw and commanding. "Now." The door was yanked open, revealing a man whose face was hidden by a dusty red bandana. Only his eyes were visible, cold and hard as river stones. He brandished a Colt revolver with a familiarity that spoke of a life lived on the wrong side of the law. The other passengers, a portly salesman and a young couple from back east, scrambled out with their hands, raised their faces, pale with terror. Megan followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her emerald travel dress a garish splash of color against the dun-colored landscape. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the vast plains into a shimmering mirage where the sky bled into the scorched earth. 4 other outlaws, all masked, held the driver and guard at gunpoint, their expressions grim under the wide brims of their hats. The leader, a tall man who moved with a predator's coiled grace, strode towards the passengers. "Valuables," he snarled, his voice muffled by the cloth. "Wallets, watches, jewelry. In the bag." He shoved a canvas sack at the salesman, who fumbled to drop his gold watch and billfold inside. The young couple followed suit, the woman weeping silently as she surrendered her wedding band. When the sack reached Megan, she dropped her small purse into it without hesitation. But her hand flew instinctively to her throat, closing around the delicate silver locket that rested there. It wasn't its monetary value that made her clutch it so fiercely. It was the weight of memory it contained. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a miniature portrait of Thomas, her younger brother, his smile forever frozen at the age of 7 and the year the fever had taken him. It was the one piece of her past that felt truly hers, untainted by her father's ambitions or her mother's social calculations. The leader's cold eyes fixed on her hand. "Everything I said." "It has no value to you," Megan said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's only sentimental." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. The air around him smelled of sweat horse and something acrid like burnt gunpowder. "I'll be the judge of that." He reached for the locket. Megan slapped his hand away, a reflexive act of defiance that surprised them both. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "A little fire. I like that." Before she could react, his hand shot out again, faster than a striking snake. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed around the delicate chain. He yanked. The silver links bit into her skin before snapping, leaving a raw red line across the nape of her neck. "No." The cry was torn from her, a sound of pure anguish. As he turned away, she lunged, her carefully manicured nails raking across the back of his hand. She felt her nails tear, felt them connect with skin and draw blood. He swore, spinning back to face her. For a moment she saw a flicker of raw fury in his eyes, a glint of something personal and venomous. He raised his hand as if to strike her, and she braced for the blow. But then he seemed to reconsider, a cruel smile touching the corners of his eyes. He looked down at the 4 thin, bloody scratches on his hand, and then back at her. He opened his palm, revealing the locket. With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he snapped it open, glanced at the tiny portrait inside, and then snapped it shut. "A shame," he said, his voice laced with mock sympathy. He dropped the locket into his own pocket, separate from the sack of valuables. Debts must be paid one way or another. The cryptic words meant nothing to her, lost in the searing pain of her loss. He turned and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "Let's ride," he shouted to his men. They spurred their horses, vanishing in a cloud of dust as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the passengers standing stunned and violated under the oppressive Colorado sun. The young woman was sobbing in her husband's arms. The salesman was muttering about his losses. But Megan stood rigid, her hand pressed to her throat where the locket used to be the stinging line on her neck, a pale echo of the gaping wound in her heart. She stared at the horizon where the outlaws had disappeared, a cold, hard resolve solidifying within her. She would get it back. No matter what it took, she would find the man with the scratched hand, and she would reclaim the last precious piece of her brother. 2 days later, the grandeur of her family home felt alien and suffocating. The Sloan Ranch house, a 2-story monument to her father's ambition, was all polished mahogany Persian rugs and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the very sun that had borne witness to her violation. Cedar Ridge was abuzz not with news of the robbery. Such things were a regrettable but common feature of the frontier, but with the impending announcement of her engagement to Logan Pierce. "You must put it out of your mind, Megan," her father, Charles Sloan, instructed, his voice gruff. At 58, he was a formidable man, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles against weather cattle and competitors. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and a traumatized daughter was a clear liability on the eve of the most important business merger of his life. "You're safe now. A few trinkets lost is a small price to pay." "It wasn't a trinket, Father," Megan said, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "It was Thomas's locket." Charles waved a dismissive hand. "We can have another made. The important thing is tonight. Logan Pierce will be here along with every influential man in the territory. This alliance will secure our future." Her mother, Tara, a woman whose Virginia-bred gentility had been hardened by 25 years on the frontier, fussed with the pearl buttons on Megan's emerald silk dress. "Hold still, dear. Your father is right. Tonight will cement our family's position as the most powerful ranching dynasty in Colorado." She fastened a heavy diamond necklace around Megan's throat, its cold weight feeling more like a yoke than an adornment. "This belonged to my grandmother. She wore it when she married into the Winslow plantation family, a symbol of a great union." Megan touched the stones. Everything felt hollow, a performance for an audience she had no desire to please. "Mother, are you certain about Logan Pierce? I've only spoken with him 3 times. "Certainty is a luxury poor folks indulge in," Tara replied, her tone crisp and final. "Rich folks make practical choices. Logan Pierce owns 40,000 acres. Your father's 30,000 combined with his will create an empire." The sounds of the party filtered through the walls of the back room of the Crystal Palace Saloon, which her father had rented and transformed for the occasion. Fiddle music, the clink of glasses, the hearty laughter of men who measured their worth in longhorns and land. It was a world of power and calculation, and she was the currency being exchanged. When she entered the main room on her father's arm, a hush fell over the 200 guests. The air was thick with the scent of perfumed cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. Ranchers' wives in their finest gowns nodded their approval, their eyes assessing her as they would a prize heifer. But as her gaze swept the room, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. The makeshift altar by the piano where the Reverend from Denver stood nervously checking his pocket watch was empty. Logan Pierce was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Pierce?" Charles muttered, his smile tightening at the edges. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The festive atmosphere began to curdle. Guests whispered behind their hands, their speculative glances feeling like tiny barbs against her skin. "Perhaps his train was delayed," Tara murmured, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. Then the saloon doors burst open. Logan Pierce strode in, not with the air of a nervous groom, but with the triumphant swagger of a conquering hero. On his arm clung a striking brunette in a garish red dress, her laughter sharp and careless. Logan was handsome in a way that made men wary and women foolish tall and broad-shouldered with dark, laughing eyes and a confident smile that suggested the world was his personal plaything. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Looks like quite the party. Sorry we're late, folks. Had some important business to attend to." The woman on his arm giggled, and Megan saw it then, a plain gold band on the third finger of her left hand. Charles stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. "Pierce, what's the meaning of this? The Reverend is waiting. We have arrangements." "Oh, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Logan said, his tone maddeningly casual as he surveyed the room. "See, I've reconsidered the arrangement. Had myself a long think about what I really want in a wife." His eyes, cold and calculating, landed on Megan. "I need a woman with fire, Charles. Steel, not silk. Your daughter, pretty as she is soft as butter left in the sun." The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This was not a private rejection. It was a public execution. "Meet my new wife, Brittany Logan," announced, raising the brunette's hand for all to see. "We were married this afternoon. Brittany here has been running her own cattle operation down in New Mexico. She can ride, shoot, and negotiate a beef contract better than most men. That's the kind of partner I need." Brittany smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes as she looked at Megan. "I do hope we can all be friends," she purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Charles's face had gone a dangerous shade of purple. "You signed a contract, Pierce, your word and mine." "Contracts can be broken, Charles, especially when the goods don't meet specifications." Logan's cruel smile never wavered. "Besides, what are you going to do? Sue me? I own half the judges between here and Kansas City." He turned his gaze back to Megan. "You've made a fool of my family," Charles snarled. Now," Logan said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need for violence. I'm sure you'll find another buyer for your daughter's charms, though I'd recommend lowering your asking price. She's damaged goods now." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, looking back at Megan one last time. His eyes held a strange, unreadable expression. "No hard feelings, sweetheart? You'll understand someday. This is just business." They swept out, leaving behind a crater of shock and humiliation. The whispers started immediately, sharp and cutting. Humiliated. Charles must be ruined. What man would want her now? Her father stood frozen, the architect of a ruined empire. But then he turned, and the look in his eyes was more devastating than Logan's cruelty. "This is your fault," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the hushed room. "You must have done something to drive him away. A real woman would have secured him." The accusation, coming from her own father, shattered the last of her composure. He saw her not as a daughter to be protected, but as a failed investment. He saw the waste of money, the loss of status, and he laid it all at her feet. Alone adrift in a sea of pitying stares and her parents' bitter recriminations, Megan turned and walked out of the Crystal Palace. She didn't look back. The cold night air was a shock against her heated skin. She walked aimlessly, the sound of her heeled boots clicking a lonely rhythm on the boardwalk. She was no longer Megan Sloan, heiress to a ranching dynasty. She was just Megan, disgraced, disowned, and utterly terrifyingly alone. Her wandering feet led her to the rough end of town, to a place she had only ever heard about in hushed, disapproving tones. The Silver Dollar Saloon squatted under the stars, its paint peeling its windows grimy. The raucous sound of a badly played piano and coarse laughter spilled out into the street. It was the last place on earth a lady should be, which made it, she decided, the perfect place for her. She pushed through the batwing doors. The air inside the Silver Dollar Saloon was thick enough to chew a foul stew of stale beer sweat and cigar smoke. Sawdust stuck to the floor in damp clumps, and the out-of-tune piano was barely audible over the roar of drunken laughter. Her emerald silk dress, a beacon of another world, drew a few curious stares, but the patrons, a rough mix of cowboys, drifters, and miners, quickly returned to their drinks. She was just one more soul-seeking oblivion at the bottom of a glass. She made her way to the bar, a long slab of wood, scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten sorrows. The bartender, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks, eyed her warily. "You lost, miss?" "No," Megan said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Whiskey, the strongest you have." He raised a bushy eyebrow, but didn't argue, pouring 3 fingers of amber liquid into a smudged glass. The first swallow was pure fire, a searing trail down her throat that made her eyes water. It was a clean, honest pain, a welcome distraction from the tangled mess of her emotions. She pushed the empty glass forward. Another. From a shadowy corner table, a quiet voice drawled, "Easy there. That ain't lemonade?" She turned to see a man watching her, his chair tilted back against the wall. He was dressed in worn but clean denim, his boots scuffed from honest work. Dark hair curled from under the brim of his hat, and his face, weathered by sun and wind, was unexpectedly kind. When he offered a small, sympathetic smile, it transformed him completely. "I'm well aware," she replied coolly. He chuckled softly and rose from his table, moving with the easy, rolling grace of a man who spent his life in a saddle. "Dylan Harrington," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "And you're Megan Sloan, if I'm not mistaken." "You are not." The second whiskey went down smoother, spreading a deceptive warmth through her limbs. Dylan gestured to his table. "Mind if I buy you the next round? Seems like you could use some company that ain't judging." Every rule of propriety she had ever learned screamed no. But those rules belonged to a life that no longer existed. "Why not?" she said, gathering her ruined dress and following him. He held her chair for her, a small gesture of gentlemanly respect that felt jarringly out of place in the Silver Dollar. "Heard there was a commotion up at the Crystal Palace," he said, his tone gentle. Megan gave a bitter laugh. The whole territory heard. Logan Pierce made sure of it. "Man's got a cruel streak wider than the Colorado River," Dylan said, and the quiet anger in his voice was a balm to her wounded pride. Loosened by the whiskey, the words began to pour out of her, the humiliation, her father's blame. Logan's parting shot about her being soft as butter. "Apparently, I lack the fire and steel he requires in a wife." She finished draining her third glass. "Pierce is a fool," Dylan said simply, his gaze direct and sincere. "Any man with eyes can see you've got plenty of fire. Might be buried under all that silk and proper upbringing, but it's there. I reckon a man just has to be patient enough to find it." She looked at him, then truly looked at him. He was handsome, but not in Logan's polished, predatory way. Dylan's was a sturdy, reliable kind of handsome. His hands resting on the table were calloused and capable. His eyes held a quiet integrity that she had never seen in the calculating gazes of the men in her father's circle. "You don't know me," she said, the words a weak protest. "I know you walked out of that humiliation with your head held high. I know you came in here instead of running home to cry. And I know you're drinking whiskey like a cowboy instead of falling apart. That tells me enough." He leaned forward. "So what'll you do now?" The question hung in the smoky air. What would she do? I honestly don't know. She confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "No decent man will have me now. My parents blame me for their ruin. I have nothing. That ain't true, he said softly. You got yourself. His simple, unwavering belief in her was more intoxicating than the whiskey. He saw not a disgraced heiress or a failed asset, but a woman of strength. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the mournful notes of the piano. Tell me something, Megan Sloan. Dylan said finally, his voice low. What do you want? No one had ever asked her that. Her life had been a series of expectations to be met, duties to be fulfilled. I've never been allowed to want anything for myself. Well, that's a damn shame. He leaned closer, his expression serious. If you need a husband, ma'am, he said, his voice a low murmur, I reckon I could oblige. The words were so unexpected, so utterly absurd, that for a moment she thought she had misheard him. She stared speechless. You're drunk. Maybe a little, he admitted with a wry grin. But I mean it. Marry me. Tonight. That's insane, she breathed. We're strangers. What's to know? You're a woman who's been dealt a bad hand and needs a new start. I'm a man who works hard, owns his own land, and could use a partner to build a life with. Seems simple enough to me. Why, she asked, her head spinning. Why would you make such an offer to me? His gaze was steady, unwavering. Because I've been watching you tonight. And I see a woman with steel in her backbone, even if she don't know it yet. A woman who deserves a damn sight better than what she got. I'm offering you a way out. A new name. A new life. No frills, mind you. Just honest work and a man who will treat you with respect. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and rough, a grounding presence in her chaotic world. I ain't got much, but what I have would be yours. We could help each other out. Her mind raced. Go home to her parents' scorn and disappointment, face a society that would forever see her as Logan Pierce's reject, or take a wild, desperate gamble on a stranger in a run-down saloon. It wasn't a choice between good and bad. It was a choice between a slow death and a terrifying leap into the unknown. I have no dowry, she said, testing him. My father's finances are ruined. I bring nothing but scandal. I don't want a dowry, he said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. I want a partner. Someone to stand with me. Someone with fire. There was that word again. Fire. Logan had used it as a weapon, a measure of her inadequacy. Dylan spoke it like a treasure he had uncovered. It was the whiskey. It was the despair. It was the first glimmer of hope she had felt all night. It was the simple, profound kindness in a stranger's eyes. She took a deep breath, the foul saloon air filling her lungs. It smelled, she thought, like freedom. Yes, she whispered the word, feeling both reckless and right. Yes, I'll marry you. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Dylan's face, lighting up his eyes. Jake, he called to the bartender. You know where to find the preacher this time of night. Jake grinned. Probably passed out at the boarding house, but for $5, I can get him here sober enough to read the vows. Done, Dylan said, pulling a few coins from his pocket. As Jake hurried out, Dylan turned back to Megan, his smile softening. Last chance to back out Megan Sloan. She looked at her torn dress, at the nearly empty whiskey glass, at the kind, steady face of the man who was offering her not a kingdom, but a foothold. For the first time in her life, she was making a decision that was entirely her own. I'm sure, she said. And to her own astonishment, she realized she was. 30 minutes later, Megan stood before a swaying, bleary-eyed preacher and the saloon's 2 remaining patrons serving as witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no crowd of Colorado's elite. There was only the smell of stale beer, the flickering lamplight, and Dylan Harrington, his hand holding hers, his vows spoken in a clear, steady voice that cut through the haze of whiskey and despair. When the preacher mumbled, "And do you, Megan Sloan, take this man?" she looked at Dylan. She saw not a solution to her problems, but a fellow traveler offering a hand in the dark. It was the most reckless act of her life. "I do," she said. The kiss that sealed their vows was gentle and tasted of whiskey and promises. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but one of mutual desperation, a pact made between two lonely souls in the dead of night. As Dylan slipped a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, one he'd bought from Jake the bartender for $10, a strange sense of peace settled over her. She was no longer Megan Sloan, the disgraced daughter. She was Mrs. Harrington. Whatever that meant, it was a beginning. The sun rose on a world that felt brand new and terrifyingly strange. Megan woke in the back of a buckboard wagon, a rough wool blanket her only shield against the morning chill, her head pounding a painful rhythm. Dylan sat on the driver's seat, his silhouette steady against the pink and gold sky. "Morning sunshine," he said, his voice gentle. "How's the head?" Like it was used for horseshoe practice, she mumbled, sitting up. The vast empty plains stretched in every direction. "Where are we going?" "Home," he answered simply. "My place is about 15 miles south of town." Home. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions. She had married this man, this stranger. Now she was on her way to his life, a life she couldn't begin to imagine. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. "Dylan," she began, her voice trembling. "About last night?" "We were both drinking. If you want an annulment, I'll understand." He pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to face her. In the clear morning light, she saw the sincerity etched into the lines around his deep brown eyes. "Do you want one?" Did she? The sensible part of her, the part that had been trained and conditioned for 22 years, screamed yes. But the new fledgling part of her, the part that had stood up in a saloon and taken a desperate chance, was silent. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough. My offer stands. I made a vow. But this is your choice, Megan. You ain't a prisoner. If you decide this life ain't for you, I'll take you back to Denver myself. No questions asked." He clucked to the horses, and the wagon rolled on the quiet promise hanging in the air. An hour later, he pointed to a small cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. "There she is. The Harrington spread." Megan's heart sank. It wasn't a spread. It was a speck. A small log cabin that could have fit inside her father's dining room, a leaning barn, a chicken coop, and a pigsty. It was the physical embodiment of a hard, solitary life. "It ain't the Sloan mansion," Dylan said quietly, sensing her disappointment. "But it's mine. Built it with my own 2 hands. No debts, no mortgages. It's honest." He helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong and sure at her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington." The inside of the cabin was one room. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chair shelves, holding a few dishes and books, and a ladder leading to a sleeping loft. It was clean and starkly simple. She stood in the middle of the room, her ruined silk dress a ridiculous relic from another lifetime, and felt the full weight of her impulsive decision crash down on her. I'll sleep in the barn," Dylan said, his voice strained with an awkward courtesy. "Give you some space. To think." The days that followed were a brutal education. The life of a rancher's wife was a relentless cycle of chores for which she had no skills. Her first attempt at biscuits produced inedible charcoal lumps. Her hands, soft and pale, were soon raw and blistered from scrubbing, hauling, and weeding. Milking Bessie, the farm's lone, perpetually unimpressed cow, was a daily battle of wills that Megan usually lost, often ending with a kicked-over pail and her sitting in the mud, weeping with frustration. Through it all, Dylan was patient. He never mocked her failures, though a smile often played at the corners of his mouth. He showed her how to knead dough, how to coax milk from a stubborn cow, how to mend a fence with steady, capable hands. He taught her not with words of pity, but with a quiet, shared labor that slowly forged a bond between them. Slowly, respect began to grow in the space where romance should have been. She respected his tireless work ethic, his kindness to his animals, his quiet integrity. He in turn seemed to respect her stubborn refusal to give up. He saw the fire he'd spoken of not in grand gestures, but in the determined set of her jaw as she tried for the 10th time to bake a loaf of bread that didn't resemble a rock. Their evenings were quiet, spent on opposite sides of the fireplace. One night she saw him reading a worn, leather-bound book. It was Shakespeare. They began to talk first about books, and then about the world, then about themselves. She discovered a sharp, curious mind behind his quiet exterior. He in turn discovered the intelligent, observant woman who had been hidden beneath layers of social polish. A fragile shoot of affection began to push its way through the hard-packed soil of their practical arrangement. As the weeks turned into months, Megan felt a change within herself. The endless, physically demanding work stripped away the soft, useless layers of her former life. Her body grew stronger, her hands calloused. She learned the rhythms of the land, the satisfaction of a well-stocked pantry, the quiet beauty of a sunrise over the mountains. She was becoming a different woman, tougher, more capable, more real. One afternoon, consumed by a need for answers, she rode into Cedar Ridge. She needed to know what had become of her family, and she needed to investigate the robbery that had set her entire life on this new course. She found the town sheriff, a weary man named Jebediah Stone, in his office. "The stagecoach robbery," he said, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "That case went cold faster than a biscuit on a tin plate. Bunch of professionals. Hit a few other targets all connected to your father's business, then vanished. Odd thing was, they weren't just after cash. Seemed personal." "What do you mean personal?" Megan asked. "Stole deeds contracts. Things that would hurt Charles Sloane's operations more than a simple cash theft. And the leader. Witnesses said he was different. Cold. Disciplined. Not your usual hot-headed bandit." The sheriff's words planted a seed of suspicion. The robberies weren't random. They were targeted. And the leader's cryptic parting words, "Debts must be paid," echoed in her mind. On her way out of town, she saw Logan Pierce looking prosperous and confident exiting the land office. He didn't see her, but she saw him, and for a fleeting moment as he gestured with his hand, she saw a faint pale scar across the back of it, 4 thin parallel lines. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. The scratch she had given the outlaw. Was it possible? The thought was too monstrous to contemplate, but it took root in her mind. Back at the cabin, driven by a new urgency, she began a different kind of investigation. She wrote to a former family lawyer in Denver, a man her father had dismissed years ago, asking for any information on old business disputes involving the Sloane Ranch. She told herself she was just looking for context for the robberies, but a darker suspicion fueled her search. A month later, a thick envelope arrived. Inside were copies of old land deeds and legal correspondence from 2 decades prior. As she spread them on the kitchen table, a story of ruthless ambition emerged. It detailed a series of transactions in which her father, Charles Sloane, had systematically acquired land and water rights from his neighbors through predatory loans and legal loopholes. One name appeared again and again, Elias Pierce, Logan's father. The documents painted a grim picture. Charles Sloan had leveraged a drought year to his advantage, cutting off Elias Pierce's access to a shared creek, forcing him to sell his cattle at a ruinous loss, and then buying his foreclosed ranch for pennies on the dollar. A final brittle newspaper clipping told the end of the story. Elias Pierce, ruined and disgraced, had taken his own life, leaving behind a young son. Logan. The room tilted. Logan's public humiliation of her wasn't a whim. His comment, "This is just business," hadn't been casual cruelty. It had been a declaration. He was systematically destroying her father, just as her father had destroyed his. The stagecoach robberies targeting Sloan's assets, the theft of her locket, it was all part of a long, cold, calculated revenge. She wasn't just a casualty of a failed business deal. She was a pawn in a generational war she never knew existed. And the man who had stolen her brother's memory was the same man she had once been set to marry. The revelation left her breathless. She looked around the small, simple cabin at the life she had built from the ashes of that humiliation. A life of hardship and honest work, but also a life of peace and burgeoning affection, with a good, kind man. Logan's revenge had inadvertently given her the one thing she never would have found in her old life: freedom. But now his quest for vengeance was no longer a distant story. He was back. A new rider had been seen in the territory, a man of wealth and influence, buying up land, consolidating power. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. Logan Pierce had returned, his fortune mysteriously restored, and he was tightening the noose around what was left of her father's crumbling empire. He came to their valley on a crisp autumn afternoon, not as a drifter, but as a king surveying his domain. He rode a magnificent black stallion and was flanked by 2 hired guns. He stopped at the edge of their property, his gaze sweeping over the modest cabin and well-tended fields with an air of dismissive appraisal. "Harrington," he called out, his voice carrying the old arrogance. Dylan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his body instantly tense. Megan came to the cabin door, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Pierce Dillon said, his voice a low growl, "You ain't welcome here." "Oh, I think I am," Logan said with a thin smile. "I've recently acquired the land titles for most of this valley. Your little plot is the last holdout. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. Far more than this worthless patch of dirt is worth." "My land's not for sale," Dillon said, his stance unwavering. Logan's eyes shifted to Megan, a flicker of something dark and possessive in them. "Still playing the happy little rancher's wife, Megan, I have to admit the rustic look suits you. But this charade must be getting old. Your father is a broken man. I own everything that was his. His name is mud in this territory, and it's all thanks to you." To me, Megan's voice was sharp. "This is about what my father did to yours." Logan's smile vanished. He dismounted, walking towards the fence that separated them. "So you figured it out. Clever girl." "Yes, your father destroyed my family. He built his empire on my father's grave. I'm simply returning the favor. An eye for an eye, a ranch for a ranch, a legacy for a legacy." He looked directly at her. "And a daughter for a father." He was admitting it. He was the outlaw. He was the man who had ripped her brother's locket from her neck. "You have your revenge," Megan said, struggling to keep her voice even. "You've ruined him. Leave us out of this." "Leave you out?" Logan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You were supposed to be the final piece, the ultimate humiliation. Marrying Charles Sloan's precious daughter only to cast her aside. But you survived. You found this nobody. You built this pathetic little life. It ruins the symmetry of it all. He leaned against the fence, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But it's not too late. Leave him. Come with me. I can give you back the life you were meant to have. I have the life I want, Megan said, moving to stand beside Dylan. Logan's face hardened. You're making a mistake. I will own this valley, one way or another. He turned to Dylan. And as for you, Cowboy, you'll find that getting in my way has consequences. He mounted his horse and rode off, his hired guns trailing behind him like vultures. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Logan wasn't just a memory of a past humiliation anymore. He was a clear and present danger, and they were standing on the one piece of ground he had yet to conquer. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that escalated into a tormented shriek. It started with a few stray wisps of sand dancing across the hard-packed earth. But within minutes, the world dissolved into a churning, blinding maelstrom of dust and grit. A sandstorm. It descended on the valley with biblical fury, erasing the horizon and turning midday into a suffocating twilight. Megan and Dylan had been riding back from the far pastures, trying to herd a few stray cattle closer to the barn when the storm hit. They were caught in the open miles from home. The air became unbreathable, a thick, gritty soup that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. We'll never make it back to the cabin, Dylan yelled over the roar of the wind. The old Crystal Palace. It's closer. We can take shelter there. He pointed into the brown chaos. The Crystal Palace saloon, the site of Megan's public execution, had been abandoned for years after a fire gutted its upper floor. It now stood as a skeletal ruin on the edge of town, a monument to broken dreams. It was their only hope. They spurred their horses heads down against the stinging sand and stumbled towards the dilapidated structure. They half fell from their saddles, tying the panicked horses to a hitching post that groaned in protest against the wind's assault. Pushing open the warped saloon doors, they collapsed inside, gasping for air, the world outside a raging, howling vortex. The interior was a graveyard of memories. Dust lay thick as snow on overturned tables and broken chairs. Tattered remnants of white ribbons left over from her phantom engagement party clung to a tarnished chandelier, stirring like pale ghosts in the drafts. The air was stale with the smell of decay and regret. And they were not alone. From the far side of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. Well, a familiar voice drawled. Look what the storm blew in. Logan Pierce stood by the ruined bar, a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. The gun was aimed squarely at Dylan's chest. Behind him stood his two hired thugs and their own weapons drawn. What do you want? Pierce Dylan asked, slowly pushing Megan behind him. I want to finish our conversation. Logan said, his voice dangerously calm. This storm is a gift. No witnesses, no interruptions. Just the three of us settling old family business. He gestured with his pistol towards a chair. Sit, both of you. There was no choice. They sat at a dusty table, the wind rattling the boarded-up windows like a caged beast. The lantern cast long dancing shadows, turning Logan's face into a cruel mask. You think you understand, Megan, but you don't. He began, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. You read some old papers. You think it was just about land. It wasn't. Your father didn't just ruin my father. He humiliated him. He bled him dry, then laughed about it in this very room. He toasted his own success, while my father sat in his empty house with a single bullet for company. The raw pain in his voice was terrifying. This wasn't just revenge. It was an obsession that had consumed him. My father killed himself because of what your father did. Logan spat the words like venom. I was 14. I found him. I swore on his grave that I would take everything from Charles Sloan. His land, his money, his reputation, and his most prized possession. His daughter. He smiled, a chilling, broken thing. The plan was perfect. I'd make my fortune return as a respectable suitor, win you, and then, on our wedding day, I would destroy you in front of everyone, just as your father destroyed mine. A public ruin for a public ruin. He took a step closer, the gun unwavering. But you didn't break. You survived. You married this dirt scratcher. He kicked at a loose floorboard. And you built a life. An honest life. The very thing your father stole from mine. The irony is almost poetic. You've won, Logan, Megan pleaded. You have everything. Let us go. It's not enough, he whispered. As long as you're happy, my revenge is incomplete. As long as he is alive, you have hope. He raised the pistol, centering the barrel on Dylan's heart. But I can fix that. When the storm clears, they'll find your bodies. A tragic accident. No one will question it. The wind howled a Greek chorus to their drama. A loose shutter banged rhythmically against the side of the building, a frantic ticking clock. Dust seeped through the cracks in the walls, the grit coating Megan's tongue. This was it. This was where it ended. You talk about legacy and family honor. Dylan said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unexpected authority. You don't know the first thing about it? Logan laughed. And you do, a penniless cowboy with a half-starved herd. What could you possibly teach me about legacy? My family doesn't measure its legacy in acres or dollars. Dylan said, his eyes locking with Logan's. We measure it in our name. A name that means something in this territory. A name you'd know if you ever looked past your own bitterness. Enlighten me, Logan sneered. Harrington Dillon, said the name, dropping into the tense silence like a stone. Dillon Harrington. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a slow dawning comprehension spread across Logan's face, followed by disbelief. Harrington, the Harrington cattle empire. That's impossible. The heir disappeared years ago. He didn't disappear, Dylan said. He just got tired of men like you who can only see the money and not the man. He wanted to see if he could build something on his own, with his own 2 hands. The revelation hit Logan like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mind reeling. The penniless cowboy he was about to murder was the sole heir to a fortune that dwarfed anything the Sloans or the Pierces had ever possessed. The sheer, staggering irony of it caused his grip on the revolver to slacken for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Megan needed. She grabbed the heavy, half-empty whiskey bottle from the center of the table and hurled it at the lantern Logan held. The glass shattered, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the faint, filtered light from the storm outside. Now she screamed. Dylan lunged, not at Logan, but at the 2 hired guns tackling them in the disorienting blackness. A shot rang out wild and deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash a brief, brilliant star. Megan scrambled across the floor, her hands searching for anything to use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy, splintered chair leg. Logan, roaring in frustration, fired again, the bullet splintering the wall near her head. She could hear the sounds of a desperate struggle, grunts, curses, the thud of fists on flesh as Dylan fought against 2 men. She had to end it. She rose to her feet, chair leg held like a club, and moved towards the sound of Logan's voice. She saw his silhouette against a dust-choked window. He was raising his pistol, trying to get a clear shot at the melee where Dylan fought. "Logan," she yelled. He turned, and in that instant, she swung with all the strength born of fear and desperation. The wood connected with his gun hand with a sickening crack. The revolver clattered to the floor. He cried out in pain and rage, clutching his wrist. He stumbled towards her in the darkness, his good hand reaching for her throat. Suddenly, the saloon doors burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the brown gloom, a shotgun leveled. "Drop it," Pierce Sheriff Stone's voice boomed over the wind. "It's over." Logan froze. The fight in the corner stopped. The storm still raged outside, but inside the ruined saloon, a sudden deafening silence fell. It was finished. Logan Pierce, his face a mask of disbelief and his arm broken, was led away in irons by Sheriff Stone and his deputy. The hired guns, nursing their own injuries, followed. As the lawmen disappeared into the storm, Megan sagged against Dylan, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. They stood that way for a long time. Two survivors in the eye of the storm, the dust of old ghosts settling around them. When the storm finally broke and a weak, watery sun emerged, they rode home. The world was scoured clean, remade. Their small cabin, which had survived the gale, had never looked so beautiful. That night, after the exhaustion had worn off, they talked. Dylan told her the full story of his inheritance, of the suffocating weight of wealth and expectation, of his desperate need to be loved for himself alone. "When I met you," he said, his hand covering hers on the rough-hewn table, "you were at your lowest point. You had nothing, and you still had more strength and integrity than any woman I'd ever known. I fell in love with the woman, Megan. The fortune, that's just details." A few weeks later, Megan traveled to Denver. She found her father working as a clerk in a dusty boarding house. His shoulders stooped, his eyes hollowed out by defeat. Her mother took in, sewing, her delicate hands, chapped and tired. There were no recriminations, no blame. There was only the quiet, painful space of all that had been lost. Megan sat with her father in the boarding house's dreary parlor. "I know what you did to Elias Pierce," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Charles Sloane didn't deny it. He simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "I was ambitious," he whispered, his voice raspy with regret. "I thought that was all that mattered. Building something, a legacy. I lost everything, Megan. My ranch, my name, my family." "You haven't lost me," she said, taking his worn hand in hers. It was not a full absolution, not an easy forgiveness, but it was a start, a bridge across the chasm of his mistakes. They couldn't undo the past, but perhaps they could find a way to live with it. Months turned into a year. Megan and Dylan made a decision. They reclaimed the Harrington fortune not for themselves, but for a purpose. They established a trust managed by scrupulous lawyers in Denver, with a single anonymous directive to buy back the land and restore the water rights to the small ranchers and homesteaders that Charles Sloane and others like him had ruined over the years. Parcels of land were returned, debts were forgiven, all by a mysterious benefactor whose identity was never revealed. One of the largest tracts, the original Pierce Ranch, was deeded to a distant cousin of Logan's, who still lived in the territory. The cycle of vengeance was broken, not with more vengeance, but with quiet, unassuming justice. One crisp spring morning, Megan rode out alone to a quiet spot on that restored Pierce land overlooking the creek her father had once dammed. A simple new granite headstone stood there, replacing the weathered wooden cross that had marked the spot for 2 decades. It read simply, "Elias Pierce, a man of the land." From a pouch on her saddle, Megan took out a small silver object. Sheriff Stone had recovered it from Logan's possessions after his arrest. It was scratched and slightly dented, but the clasp still worked. She opened it. The tiny, smiling face of her brother Thomas looked up at her. She had her memory back. But it felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of a past she clung to, but a reminder of the journey that had forged her into the woman she was now. She closed the locket, and instead of putting it around her own neck, she gently laid it at the base of Elias Pierce's new headstone. It was an offering, an apology, a symbol of a debt finally truly paid. She looked out over the valley at the greening fields and the clear running water. She saw her own small cabin in the distance, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney, a beacon of the home, and the love she had found in the wreckage of 2 families. She had lost a future of silk and diamonds, but she had gained a life of substance and strength. She had been born a Sloan, she had almost become a Pierce, but she had fought and worked and loved her way into becoming a Harrington. And that name she knew was the only legacy that truly mattered.